It's a pleasure to introduce the next session, as it has been all the sessions, because they've been really interesting so far. The leader of this session is our very own Alicia Ventresca Miller, who is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and who's our curator of Asian archaeology in UMMA. And the title of the session is Cultivating Complexity, Societies After the Adoption of Domesticates.
Okay, thank you so much, Rob, and thank you everyone for being here today. We're going to have presentations today by 4 speakers, and the title of the session is Societies After the Adoption of Domesticates, and I'm just going to open it up and talk a little bit about what I sort of envisioned for the session and things that I'm thinking about right now in my own work. Or not. Okay, it's gonna make it difficult. Great, okay. So among the most significant of humanity's impacts has been the domestication and subsequent redistribution of a variety of species, including pastoral animals and grains. So while the process of domestication has been studied and theorized, much less attention has been paid to the process by which domesticated species were integrated into societies. So stages of this process of integration include the initial introduction of a species, their full adoption, the solidification of domesticates as the primary dietary source, and finally the intensification of production of these same species. And it's precisely the pace of these stages that is of key interest in my own work. So when domesticated species are introduced into novel locales, there are resulting changes to both societies and to environments. During these initial stages, domesticated species were adapting to and modifying new ecologies, and human familiarity with cultivated species was developing. Knowledge and technologies were likely transferred between individuals. As domesticates became an integral part of local economies, there were efforts to support and increase their productivity. So the management of domesticates might include experimentation with behavioral controls and the auditioning of cultigens in different locales. Infrastructure was developed, whether through marking of the landscape to indicate the presence of invisible infrastructure, such as pasture, or the alteration of waterways to irrigate crops or increase the productivity of fodder. The loss of domesticates, or failure to cultivate these species, played an important part of this process, which was not necessarily a linear trajectory nor a forward progression. Instead, the process by which domesticates were integrated into societies occurred in discontinuous and erratic ways, with variation in the timing and tempo of incorporation. And as you can see here, catching a sheep on the step is difficult, even if you're a 7-year-old. And so this session is really about focusing on one central question. How did the integration of domesticates transform societies? So our first speaker of the day is Dr. Stephen Acabado. He is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research engages with archaeological issues that focus on colonialism, culture contact, and indigenous empowerment. This includes an interest in human-environment interaction and indigenous responses to colonialism. His archaeological research examines highland agricultural systems in the northern Philippines, and his work established the recent inception of the Ifugao rice terraces. He argues that the artificial contrasts that we see between highland and lowland populations in the Philippines are products of colonialism and history, rather than differences in ecological adaptation. He has active research programs in indigenous Taiwan and in Bicol, Ifugao, Philippines. He's also a member of the External Advisory Board for the Reconnect Recollect project, which focuses on reparative connections to Philippine collections at the University of Michigan. His talk today is titled Bahay Kubo, the quintessential Philippine garden, networks, innovation, and foodways.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe this one.
Oh, that starts from the beginning.
Sorry.
You can use the clicker if you like.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, everyone. Uma, it's an honor to be here. I received that invitation about 2 months ago. I was actually with Dr. Grace Barreto Tesoro, and we received that invitation at the same time. It took me a while to respond because I have a scheduled travel next week, but I decided to join to honor and to pay homage to the contribution of UMA to Philippine archaeology, and also to highlight the importance of representation. I know that the University of Michigan has contributed to the development of Philippine archaeology, and most of the models that we use in Philippine chronology, Philippine archaeology is based on the work of Guta and preceding archaeologists who are connected to Michigan. I, for myself, has a somewhat connection to Michigan. My undergraduate advisor, or my graduate advisor, Miriam Stark, completed her BA here in Michigan. But without Dr. Miriam Stark and Bill Longacre, I wouldn't be here. I would like to use this venue to express my gratitude to Apo Bill. He was the one who paid for my airfare and provided the initial funding for me to be able to go to Hawaii to start my graduate program. Without him, I wouldn't be here because I was from the province. He met me at the University of the Philippines, and I think he realized or he recognized my potential. So he said, "Here's the check. Pay me with a PhD. You don't have to pay me back." So I think I paid him with interest. So my talk today is is about my work in the Philippines in Ifugao. But I'll start with something that I've done in 2020. While working on a book that just came out earlier this year, I started to think about my identity as Bicolano, as someone who is expected to eat chili peppers for breakfast, because Bicol cuisine is known for very spicy food. It's something that will burn you twice. But my work in Bicol is an offshoot of my work in Ifugao. And some of you, as some of you know, my work has focused on, again, the Ifugao and the rice terraces. Our findings in this research program has expanded my interest in looking at how archaeology can contribute to a more inclusive knowledge production. And a book that just came out that I co-authored with Marlon Martin and Ifugao exemplified this direction through a discussion of the archaeology of indigenous histories of the Philippines. And again, while preparing this book, I thought about how the long history of Spanish colonialism shaped the diverse cuisine of the Philippines, from adobo to laing to sinigang. Various ethno-linguistic groups have developed distinct preparation techniques, although the base ingredients are the same. This got me into thinking about how food defines Filipino identity, or is there such a thing as Filipino food? Again, take for example the Bicol Express and the spicy hot Bicolano laing. We know that gata or coconut milk is indigenous to the Philippines, as well as the dahon ng gabi or taro leaves, Colocasia esculenta. there are species, there are actually multiple species of coconut and taro in the country. Each species has specific characteristics that local communities use for a particular cuisine. However, without the introduction of the sili, or chili peppers, the Bicol Express, and the spicy lime would not be Bicolano at all. So this presentation argues that strengthening Filipino identity could be achieved by looking at interactions and diversity rather than focusing on pre-colonial history, at least in the Philippines, because there's this idea that to be able to understand authentic Filipino, you have to go back to deep history. And in my talk, I try to avoid the use of the term prehistory because the people that I work with has history, but they lack the means to write about them. So I use the term deep history. And as the title of this talk suggests, the Bahay Kubo, children's song, which I learned growing up in the Philippines, exemplify this argument. But please don't ask me to sing, otherwise I will ruin this presentation. Unlike many Filipinos, I don't sing. In another talk, I emphasized the importance of our positionality and writing the history of the diverse populations of the Philippines and provide our ideas on what it means to decolonize archaeology. As a discipline with a long tradition of relying on technological change and social complexity to describe change, we get into the trap of classifying cultures into stages of development, or worse, conflating artifact features and ethnicity. So in this presentation, I'm using the Bahay Kubo as a venue to start the conversation to decolonize archaeology and underscore the role of indigenous histories in crafting a more meaningful understanding of what it means to be Filipino. I also present my work in Ifugao as means to highlight the colonial foundation of history making in the Philippines. And this is complemented by discussions and introductions of plants, particularly rice, which has been like a fetish for most Southeast Asian archaeologists to look for rice. But rice, at least in the Philippines, was probably introduced 700 to 1,000 years ago, at least in the archaeological record. Well, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but so far we haven't found any evidence of wet rice that's domesticated rice earlier than 1,000 years ago. As will be mentioned later, dominant models that explain population movements in the Philippines, particularly this concept that we call Austronesian expansion, do not capture the diversity of Philippine cultures. And so these are the two editions of the book that just came out a few months ago. The left side is published by the University of Arizona Press, and the right side was published by the Ateneo de Naga University Press in the Philippines. So part of my advocacy is to make my work accessible, if not free. So publishing in the Philippines with a more accessible price is part of my advocacies. So the Bahay Kubo is a great example of the homogenocene, the widespread expansion of plants and animals brought by maritime exchanges that started when Columbus accidentally ended in the island of Hispaniola. I won't sing this song because I'm afraid that I will ruin this talk. So among the 18 plants mentioned in the song, only 2 are probably local or endemic to the Philippines: the upo, a gourd, or 3 actually, garlic and labanos, radish. The rest of the plants mentioned in the song originated from the Americas, Africa, or mainland Asia. So as such, the quintessential Philippine garden is a product of global connections that started more than 1,000 years ago. And this was published in 2020. Again, my work has an embedded community engagement and collaboration. And this book was published, a picture book that's designed for all ages, but designed for school kids. So that transoceanic exchanges and mobility have been documented archaeologically and ethnographically. But most importantly, community stories and memory talk about foreign traders interacting with our ancestors. Philippine languages, for example, are filled with borrowed South, Indic and Tamil, South Asian, Southwest, East Asian terms. Of course, Spanish terms are now considered part of our existence, but what a lot of us don't know is that we have borrowed Nawa terms, including nanay, mother, tatay, father, tiangge, and many more. The Philippines was an afterthought for the Spanish, so most of our administrators were from Mexico. The Spanish was a colony of a colony. So the number of Nawa terms in Philippine languages points to the influence of the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade that connected the Philippines to the Americas and Europe. It made the Philippines an important hub in the trans-Pacific trade that brought ideas, animals, peoples, plants, and even pathogens to the country. Whatever they are, the better or for worse, made the Philippines that we know now. The Filipino then is an outcome of recent history, of our recent experiences. However, our predilections for all things ancient gets us into the trap of romanticizing the past. Understanding our deep past is important, but it should not be the basis of national pride. For instance, our archaeological tradition is heavily invested in reconstructing pre-colonial societies, so much so that pseudo-nationalists appropriate the narrative to talk about authentic and original Filipino culture. And the long Spanish colonial experience obscured this, the indigenous Philippines. But it was different. There was a different story during the American colonization, and this was in display at the 1904 St. Louis World Exposition, where they juxtaposed highland Filipinos with the lowland constabulary band, where they're showing that colonialism worked because on the one hand, you have these savages who were eating dog meat almost every other day, and then on the other hand, you have the lowland Christianized Philippine Constabulary Band playing Western instruments and Western music. And so they were juxtaposing these two to show that the United States, America was needed in the Philippines to bring the savages into civilization. And this was articulated by the white man's burden perception that proceeded through the benevolent assimilation policy of the American colonial government. And so the St. Louis World Exposition catalyzed American influence in Philippine scholarship, particularly the development of history curricula and archaeological research. Unfortunately, this curricula developed more than 100 years ago, sorry. Still being used by the Philippine Department of Education. So the World Exposition facilitated the recognition of the Philippines in the American consciousness and improved support in the continued American occupation of the country. This was also the time that Henry H. Otley Beyer got interested in the Philippines, and he became the territorial anthropologist. Franz Boas applied for the job, and luckily for me, he didn't get it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking about the Ifugao. He probably would have sent his students, or he would have been there working on Ifugao issues. So the concept of a pure Filipino is founded on the perceived civilizing effect of the colonial experience among Philippine lowland and coastal groups. My graduate student, Maddie Yekel, argues that this is an example of othering, an imaginary identity that is contrasted with highland groups that are described as uncolonized. The problem with the concept of othering is that it implies that pre-Spanish Philippines was a monolithic culture. These boundaries do not acknowledge the diversity of the Philippine ethno-linguistic groups prior to Spanish colonization, or the diversity that persisted even after Spanish contact. In the first place, the term Filipino itself was not applied to the local inhabitants of the Las Islas Filipinas. It was used to refer to Spanish-born in the Philippines. Filipinos like me were Indios, and my great-grandfather would have been a Sangle, a Chinese. And so it wasn't until the 19th century, mid-19th century, that Filipino intellectuals co-opted the term Filipino to apply to everyone residing in the Philippines, whatever your ethnicity is. So this is the beginnings of our identity as Filipino, born out of resistance and protest amid the repressive colonial regime. An example of resistance, but perhaps more accommodation, is the Ifugao experience, where I've been working in the last almost 20 years, where isolationist models describe them as unchanging and representatives of original Filipino, a view that reifies the racist perspectives of isolation. And Ifugao identity is largely based on the historical narrative that the Spanish never conquered them, as well as the long history model, the 2,000-year-old dating of the rice terraces. According to our work, these terraces were probably constructed as late as the 1600 as responses to the arrival of the Spanish in the northern Philippines. Um, uh, and then some of the archaeological records that we found suggest that they were part of the colonial economic system. They participated in trading with the lowlands. They had access to imported goods. And of course, there was a total absence of rice and rice-related weeds in the archaeological record. So although the colonial period in the Philippines is still considered recent history by historians and archaeologists, today Ifugao, it seems like a distant, disconnected past. Archaeology reconnects the Ifugao to their ancestors and gives life to generational memory, especially practices that have been lost since conversion to Christianity. As we have written in another article, and I quote, stories fade into legends and legends become myths, then faint memories, then archaeology. For the Ifugao who straddles both the old world and the new, there is hope for their heritage if such interest is rekindled by their participation in archaeology. It is strange to the Ifugao, yet appropriate, relearning stories of their past, broken pots and weathered bones, artifacts from unrecalled times, are pieces in a jigsaw puzzle of a forgotten past. These things pique the interest of the modern Ifugao when hard science completes bits and pieces of tales from the ancient. So there's really no conflict between community stories and archaeology. So the Ifugao Archaeological Project focused on the old Kiangan village from 2012 to 2016 from those terraces, the lower valley, and they left that valley and transferred to several other localities, maybe after 1832 when Colonel Galvey sacked the village for as a punitive response to the Ifugao attacking their supply route down in the lowlands. So the work of the IAP, we've excavated from 2012 to 2016, and we continue to work with the Ifugao elders, suggests that the arrival of the Spanish in the region coincided with the expansion of the village and observed economic intensification. Excavations provided evidence of 3 occupational layers and 3 distinct pottery assemblages. The excavation, as I mentioned earlier, unearthed locally produced and imported beads and ceramics. These findings attest to the active participation of the Ifugao community in pre-colonial interactions in the country. So to show that I'm really an archaeologist, I have some radiocarbon dates here that's just perfectly superposed. And we also have energetics data that suggests that these terraces could have been constructed within a few years, not thousands of years. So we work with farmers in documenting a construction chronology for their terraces, and the spatial information for these UNESCO World Heritage sites suggested that this could have been constructed by 4.5 workers working 7.5 hours per day, 6 days a week within 99 years. So of course, you would have more than 4.5 people working. So this could have been constructed within a few years. So the brief summary of Fugao archaeology and the romanticism of older is better is a reflection of how we look at archaeology. And this is probably because of the history of the establishment of archaeology in the country. So Dr. Grace Barreto Tesar and I are coming up with an article to recommend a new kind of chronology in the Philippines, something that highlights local experiences rather than the three-age system that we still use today. The Philippines doesn't have a Neolithic, but we still use that term to refer to the arrival of this group that we call the Austronesians. We don't have evidence of rice. Even genetics analysis of rice suggests that they came from the south rather than from the north. My work also suggests that the adoption of rice agriculture was a conscious effort for the Ifugao to resist the Spanish. Rice agriculture requires a specific form of social organization, and so the shift to wet rice agriculture allowed that organizational shift to successfully resist Spanish attacks. So, so there's So here's Laing. I have maybe 30 more seconds. The movement of plants, animals, ideas, and peoples was not one way as well. As we know, Eurasians also took Asians also sent items to the Europe and in the New World, and I just wanted this here that without the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, the development of tequila would have been late because the Filipino tripulantes or crew members who were stranded in Acapulco brought the technology to distill tequila in Mexico. So I think what I'm saying here is that we should attempt to break these state boundaries when we work on these types of issues, that we should work with our colleagues across, in this case, in the Philippines, across the Pacific. So I will stop there, and if you have any questions later, I'm happy to answer. Maraming salamat.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I think we're going to save questions until the end when we have the panel. So the next person that I'd like to introduce is Dr. Rowan Flad. He is the John E. Hudson Professor of Archaeology at Harvard University. His research is focused on the emergence and development of complex societies during the late Neolithic period and the Bronze Age in China. This work incorporates interests in diachronic change in production processes and technology, the intersection between ritual activity and production, and of course, the role of animals in early Chinese society. Particularly the use of animals in sacrifice and divination, and the processes involved in social change. He has conducted excavations at a salt production site in the eastern Sichuan Basin, regional archaeological survey in the Chengdu region, focusing on prehistoric settlement patterns and social evolution. And he's directing an international collaborative project with survey and excavation components in the Tao River Valley in Gansu. The project works on technological change in various domains and investigates the formation processes of community interaction involved in the development of the Proto-Silk Road. His talk today is titled Animals as Sources of Social Power in Second Millennium Archaeological Contexts in China.
Thank you, Alicia, very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well. I wanted to thank everybody involved in the organization of today's event, both for the hospitality and for the invitation. I'm excited to be here, particularly on this panel, with an honor to be collected with some people whose work I respect very much. My connection to Michigan is much more tangential than many in the room today. I was, in fact, the temporary secretary in the Department of Anthropology for a short period of time under the chairmanship of Dick Ford, but that's about it. And I did apply and get rejected from the department, like other people have mentioned. But I'm very happy to be here nonetheless. Recently, my research has been focused increasingly on aspects of the sociopolitics of archaeology, which connects with many of the themes that were discussed yesterday, and also themes that we've just heard in relation to Stephen's work. But to align with the theme of the session today, I've revisited previous interests related to zooarchaeology in particular, but with an entirely new, for me, framing. So I beg your patience. I was a bit of a last-minute addition as well, and so what I've put together is very much in its formative stages. So hopefully there are some elements that are not completely without merit, and in any case, this exercise is helping me tie together a variety of practices that have been observed by others and myself concerning the political uses to which animals were put in the context of human-animal interactions in the second millennium BC on China. I'm a little worried about the time, so I'm going to read quickly, probably, the rest of what I have to say. In the 2021 book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, which was referenced several times already in this conference by Matt and Keisha yesterday and discussed by Dietrich, David Graeber and David Wengrow define three separate sources of social power: violence, knowledge, and charisma, and argue that these sources crystallized into institutional forms that constitute the origins of three elements of state regimes: sovereignty, bureaucracy, and competitive politics. Ian Morris has insightfully pointed to the debt that this scheme owes to the work of Michael Mann, which you see on the right-hand part of the slide, who identifies four sources of social power: ideological, economic, military, and political in his framework. While Graeber and Wengrow cite Mann in their bibliography, their scheme and associated discussion doesn't engage with the relationship between the two approaches, nor have they produced an explicitly different framework. Ostensibly, it would seem that their discussion of violence aligns with Mann's comments on military organization and coercion, but with a bit of a broader remit and relating to some of the issues we heard yesterday. Knowledge reflects the ideological power that Mann relates to the construction of meaning, establishment of norms, and engagement in aesthetic and ritual practices. And charisma concerns political maneuvering. On this last point, however, Mann's discussion of political sources of power primarily focuses on territorial control rather than political aggrandizing, and Graeber and Wengrow might therefore assign aspects of this source primarily to the effects of violence, while likewise their lack of an explicit corollary with Mann's economic source seems to be based on a belief that control of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption must be backed up by threat or engagement in force or violence, or by political manipulation and maneuvering, which they would assign to charisma. Accordingly, they lean away from the assigning of any a priori power to situations where resources are unevenly distributed or formalist economic rationalizations or manipulations are employed. I, however, see this as a separate possible source of power that can be activated in certain circumstances. My intention in this essay is not to attempt to disentangle the details of the relationship between the Graeber and Wengrow scheme and the one of Mann. Instead, I'm using these two examples of frameworks to inform how we can understand the use of animals as sources of social power in human social settings. Here, social power is understood as the application of an ability to pursue and attain goals through mastery of one's environment, to quote Mann, that involves exercising authority over other people, as inspired by Weber, and or with the ability or capacity to engage in restricted activities in a social context without facing the sanctions or consequences that some in the same group would endure if they were engaged in the same action. Whereas the discussion of these frameworks by Mann and Graeber and Wengrow seem to emphasize the former, namely the wielding of power by some groups, people, or institutions over others. The latter incorporates the recognition advocated by Foucault and others that power is pervasive and dispersed and is in constant negotiation. Today, I will reference examples from archaeological contexts dating to the second millennium BC in China. The scheme I employ modifies the categories suggested by Mann and Graeber and Wengrow by swapping the notion of violence for military and adds an additional consideration, which I refer to as landscape. This notion of landscape as a source of social power concerns how the forces of nature embodied by the surroundings within which people live provide social power that can be drawn upon. Accordingly, I will briefly discuss ways in which animals became critical resource employed within human communities through their role in practices that constitute ideology, economy, violence, charismatic politics, and landscape. Reflecting on this framework as it pertains across early East Asia, we can observe how different sources of social power were activated to varying degrees in distinct contexts. In case I get cut off, the next couple sentences is essentially my conclusion. In the capital of the late Shang, the urban center of Inshu, for example, animal use reflects a significant role of ideological power, while Shang royal court also engaged with animals through violence to substantiate their authority. Contemporaneously, people in smaller settlements tied to the Shang capital employed animals and animal remains in ways that draw upon economic power and also engaged with landscape power through their relations with non-human animals. Meanwhile, in the contemporary urbanized society associated with the site of Sanxingdui in Sichuan, the use of animals more clearly reflects emphasis on charismatic politics and the power of the landscape. This essay represents very preliminary thoughts on the matter, but I hope that the expanded framework of categories may provide some food for thought concerning the social roles that animals played in power dynamics in the second millennium China and in other contexts, and set the stage for future considerations of how these sources may overlap and combine in patterned ways. According to Mann's framework, ideological power is presented as having two means: a transcendent vision of social authority and immanence, the strengthening of the internal morale of the existing social group. The former refers to the deferral to supernatural and divine authority or to collective belief as a resource that can be drawn upon to support claims of authority in a social context. The latter points to the ways in which ritual practices of various sorts provide a basis for social solidarity. A reflection of the use of animals to enhance transcendent authority in second millennium China is the development of pyro-osteomantic divination that resulted in artifacts now referred to as oracle bones, as you see some examples on the slide. As I have discussed elsewhere, evidence for oracle bone divination can be traced back to the third millennium or earlier in the form of cervid and caprine scapula that were intentionally burned on their flat areas in ways that predate but are technologically similar to the better known examples from the late second millennium BC on which the earliest preserved Chinese writing occurs. The latter oracle bones are associated with the Shang state and derive from its last capital, the site of Inshu near the modern city of Anyang. During the era of the Shang activity at this site, pyro-osteomantic divination reached the zenith of elaboration and specialization, with the animal species employed in this practice restricted to cattle and turtles, while respective scapula and plastrons were curated and pre-treated prior to being burned during divinations and eventually inscribed, in many instances, with formulaic records of the topics about which the prognostications had been focused. The individuals who could engage in this practice, according to late Shang inscriptional evidence, were limited to those associated with the royal house and other elite families. And accordingly, oracle bone divination had become, at least by the late Shang times, something restricted to a small segment of the population, whose access to the specialized knowledge associated with this form of divination draws upon the transcendent authority associated with the ancestors and a host of supernatural forces. Immanence as a means of social power, of ideological power, can be observed in the practice of animal sacrifice from second millennium BC contexts where sacrifice served as a major basis for elite authority. Identified in historical records as one of the major affairs of state, along with warfare, sacrifice in Shang context reflected a conscious giving up of life with the expectation that it would bring benefit. Graeber and Wengrow point out the benefit for which sacrifice is a means to obtain is something always out of reach. When animals were used in this process, at least within the Shang context, the ostensible source of benefit related to some of the same transcendent providers of power that are referenced in oracle bone inscriptions. But sacrifice more broadly provides a mechanism for social solidarity through the associated ritual processes. Lee and Campbell have shown that dog sacrifices in the last Shang capital of Inshu, as referenced in the image on the slide, represent a variety of related practices whereby these animals were given up. Some were sacrificed along with animals such as caprines and pigs in ceremonies dedicated to supernatural powers and ancestors in non-mortuary contexts, while others were sacrificed in association with tombs and as tomb guardians and death attendants. Most of those were interred as death attendants interred as death attendants were juvenile canines, unlikely to have been personal pets associated in a familial way with a deceased human with whom they were interred. Instead, these puppies were part of a broader ritual economy that tied members of the society together and reflect a complicated and multifaceted set of ritualized destruction phenomena. Dogs were not alone, of course, and part of a much broader set of Shang practices that involve the sacrifice of animals, particularly in burial contexts such as under building foundations or in pits. In fact, there were considerable variations in the number, age, color, taxa, and combination of animals used in sacrificial practices by the Shang, as evidenced both in textual and archaeological data, as recently discussed by Liu Yiting. While some animals were sacrificed in acts of destruction and consumption, others were parts of mortuary rites and reflect a concern with the dead as an active source of social power that could be drawn upon. The archaeological data show that at Anyang, sacrifice of the animals in the context of burials occurred in 4 primary forms, as referenced on the slide on the lower left. The full repertoire was available to those of higher status, while lower ranking tombs included fewer animal sacrifices or none at all. Furthermore, the animals were employed may have been often those specially reared for sacrificial purposes through a process of induction into a ritual status. The way in which the Shang in particular were able to develop a specialized industry of animal rearing for the purposes of animal sacrifice is furthermore a reflection of what Michel Foucault has termed biopower and associated biopolitics, principles that concern the way in which power can emerge from the administration of life and populations, including control over life and death. In the Shang context, we observe this aspect of ideological power in several ways, including the selective rearing of sacrificial animals, as well as the creation of equivalence between slaves, captives, and animals. This aspect certainly relates to the way in which violence can be a source of social power as well, as is evident in the Shang case. And I'll return to in a couple of minutes. The means of economic power, according to Mann, concern the circuits of practice by which labor and goods taken from nature are integrated. In the Shang context, evidence of circulation of animals and animal products draws our attention to the rural hinterlands that are connected to the Shang capital. One way in which this occurred was with the collection of animals that were brought to Inshu as tribute, including animals such as the turtles, whose shells were used for divinatory purposes. Another example of circulation of animal parts has been examined by Ho Yanfeng, Li Suting, and colleagues in their study of bone hairpin manufacture at the small Shang village of Guandi Miao, and the subsequent circulation of those hairpins to other sites, including Inshu. This study enhanced our understanding of the nature of economic circulation in the Shang period, not just at the capital site of Inshu, but beyond. At Guandi Miao, bone artifacts reflect a continuum of manufacture, from expedient objects made without the necessity of skilled labor to specialist-produced oracle bones and non-local craft products, identical to those made in the Shang capital. Locally made specialized bone products, like oracle bones, were made using locally specific procedures, probably made necessary due to an absence of bronze tools as well as social factors. While the presence of hairpins made at the Shang capital points to processes of interaction economically that reflect the one way in which economic power was important within the Shang cultural sphere. Other examples of the activation of economic circuits of practice involving animals can be observed in the introduction and adoption of domesticated animals into social contexts where they had not been previously raised and used. An important instance of this process is that which occurred in 2nd millennium BCE in China was the gradual incorporation by various groups of caprines into domesticated animal repertoire, which in some cases reflects a relatively major transition in lifeways towards increasingly pastoral economic practices. This is something that we've been working on in the Tao River project that Alicia mentioned. Oh boy, 5 minutes. Let me see if I can get through this. All right, horses. Violence. All right, horses were among the animals introduced to East Asia as domesticates, who presented new affordances for display and establishment of violence as a power source for the Shang, both practically and symbolically. Although there isn't evidence for the widespread adoption of horses during the Shang, the presence of horses as sacrificial victims associated with chariots as mobile platforms used in military contexts both foreshadows a more widespread use of horses in warfare in the 1st millennium and points to the symbolic significance of violence for the Shang. Returning to man, the means of this source are concentrated coercion in the context of organized battle, and more broadly are based on the activation of violence as an elementary form of domination that enables sovereignty. A concern with violence must also consider aspects of structural violence considered by Amanda Logan and other participants yesterday. Violence is manifested in a number of ways in the zooarchaeological evidence from early China beyond horses. We see animals as targets of violence, both in terms of their employ and sacrificial practices, and hunting and warfare in the first millennium are ways that were not separate activities, but rather show how hunts at once were a triumphant way for people to be triumphant over potentially hostile animal forces, a demonstration of supernatural approval as the king moved through the land, and a verification of the king's territorial claims and dominance over local leaders. Through the hunt, the aforementioned equivalence between human and animal captives was made manifest, and hunting was inextricably entwined with sacrifice and war. Graeber and Wengrow, in concluding comments that return to issues of violence, highlight the performative aspect of warfare that is evident in its interconnections. And they talk about play war in relation to that, which is something that Fiskishu has talked about in relation to hunting. All right, I'm going to move to the political aspects. In his discussion of the political source of power, Mann focuses on territorial centralization and the creation and maintenance of confined, bounded territories. In contrast, a very strong contrast, Graeber and Wengrow point us to a different connection, namely the roles of charisma and occasions that foster lavish collective activities like potlatches in establishing authority. There's ample evidence for feasting in early China from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age, including collective ritual that has been even compared explicitly to potlatching. It is noteworthy, however, that such comparison strays from the emphasis on charisma that is of central concern in the framework that Graeber and Wengrow developed. There's certainly evidence of Shang ritual feasts in the Shang capital, but I want to actually focus a bit more on the demonstrative destruction of materials. And so I turn our attention to the right-hand part of this slide, which focuses us on the site of Sanqingdui. A distinct form of using animals in efforts to display grandeur and potentially the contempt for possessions that characterizes potlatches of the northwest coast of the Americas can be seen in the ostentatious destruction of wealth evident in ritual pits at the site of Sanqingdui in Sichuan. Sanqingdui was an urban settlement that emerged from the mid-late second millennium BC, roughly contemporaneous with Inshu, but for which there are no contemporary textual records. So our understanding of the nature of power relations and social organization are based entirely on the material record. At Sanqingdui to date, few burials have been found. There's little evidence for burial practices and associated rituals being an important forum for establishing or ritualizing power differences. Instead, most of our information about practices that relate to the exploiting sources of social power comes from a series of large pits that are interpreted as being the remains of collective sacrifices. 2 such large pits were discovered in 1986 and have been the focus of extensive research, and more recently in 2021, 6 more pits were identified, excavated, and reported. And these new pits include a wide range of materials, including bronze, jade, gold, silk, and importantly for the discussion here, animal remains, particularly the tusks of Asian elephants, about which hopefully I'll be able to say a few things in a second. A possible interpretation of these large pits is that they represent episodes of collective destruction during which charismatic individuals perform their social positions by eschewing the accumulation of objects of value and reinforcing notions of collective action. And this brings me to the last category, which has been left out perhaps from preceding discussions. And that's how the forces of nature embodied by the surroundings within which people live provide a source of social power that can be drawn upon. I suggest that this can be thought of as the power of space and place, and that the landscape constituted by spaces and places is a source that must be considered in establishing a framework that we can use. By doing so, we consider how animals and other aspects of a non-human biosphere within which humans live are employed in power relations among humans and between humans and the natural world. One way in which we may recognize the activation of the landscape source is through the ways charismatic megafauna are incorporated into social practices. 2 examples of the significance of charismatic megafauna in early Chinese contexts suggest that this aspect of the power of landscape was drawn upon at places like Sanqingdui, as well as the Middle Yangtze River region more than in the Central Plains. At Sanqingdui, elephants were an important source of raw material used in the conspicuous destruction of valuables previously discussed. In addition to the more than 80 elephant tusks discovered in the first 2 pits discovered in 86, representing at least 40 elephants, and 100 tusks found at the post-Sanqingdui site of Jinsha in Chengdu City, Hundreds more have been discovered in the ritual pits discovered since 2021, or announced since then. A recent tabulation by Jay Shu lists 623 whole elephant tusks in the 6 newly excavated pits. If this number is accurate, and does not double count the tusks that may have been cut into sections, these 6 new pits alone reflect a collection of and subsequent destruction of the tusks of over 300 individual male elephants, animals that are typically territorial and do not cohabitate with other males. Previously, I've suggested that the large number of tusks reflected a widespread tribute network across the Chengdu Plain and surrounding area that would have been necessary to procure these tusks. I continue to think that this applies to the Sanqingdui case, but it's also worth noting that all male groups of Asian elephants have been observed in historical times in anthropogenic landscapes in southern India, and perhaps the large number of tusks is an oblique evidence of anthropogenic niche construction that may have occurred in the Chengdu Plain after a millennium of Neolithic and early Bronze Age settlement. Additionally, the Sanqingdui Museum rather fancifully imagines the elephants of the Chengdu Plain were domesticated and actively used in public works projects, including moving earth and trees in order to develop hydroengineering projects with dams and weirs. And I definitely recommend the 4D movie at the Sanqingdui Museum if you're ever there and can get rained on and bitten by snakes and things. Asian elephants in recent years have been used in Southeast Asia for labor, particularly logging and warfare, and recently for tourism. The abundance of tusks in the Sanqingdui context further raises the question of the roles of this species in the associated society. Elephants are a form of charismatic megafauna whose size are among the factors that encourage their use as political symbols, both in historic contexts and environmental conservation efforts today. They are among the charismatic fauna that are depicted in bronzes, presumably cast in the Middle Yangtze River region. You can see in examples on the upper right-hand part of this slide, during the late Shang period that included real animals treated with affectionate naturalism, to quote Bob Bagley. The relative absence of this animal realism from Anyang-style bronzes may reflect a different degree to which the landscape power source was activated in communities like those of the Middle Yangtze and also Sanqingdui relative to the Shang core. And I've gotten my concluding paragraph, so even if I'm over time, I'm going to finish it. All right. This framework runs the risk of reifying a series of categories that cannot be neatly separated from one another. Ideological concerns are often interwoven with political aggrandizement that may take the form of conspicuous displays of consumption or in processes of economic accumulation. Violence is evident in the practices that emerge from the immanence means of ideological power and central to biopolitics. The power vested in and extracted from the landscape can overlap with these other sources as well. Nevertheless, in the spirit of developing intellectual frameworks as called for by Patricia McEnany on the first day of this conference, I believe it is valuable to consider the ways in which different sources of power can become more or less salient in different contexts. Graeber and Wengrow contend that the activation of multiple sources in systemic ways generate higher orders of integration than in those contexts in which a discrete source of power is prominent. I can see the value of this approach while also recognizing that this may overly reify distinctions among these several heuristic sources. More useful, I think, is examining how different emphases in different social contexts help us better imagine the prevailing principles underlying social interactions in separate communities. The examples mentioned here relate to the Shang urban core, the Shang hinterland, and the Sanqingdui polity, among others, are instances of such differences and hopefully can shed some light on the ways in which engagement with animals contributed to the constitutions of these different societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rowan. That was wonderful. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. And so our next speaker is Dr. Sarah McClure, who is an associate professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She's also the director of the Mediterranean Prehistory and Paleoecology Laboratory. Sarah is an environmental archaeologist who studies the environmental and social impacts of the spread of agriculture worldwide. She sees the origins and spread of farming during the Holocene as a turning point for human environmental interaction, health, nutrition, disease, and of course, increasing social complexity. Thus, her research centers on the social and ecological impacts and legacies of early farming populations that have implications for today's issues of the adaptability and resilience of small-scale farming and biodiversity under shifting environmental, climatic, and demographic conditions. She approaches the transition to agriculture comparatively by studying two main areas. One is the gateway to European agriculture in the Eastern Adriatic, and the other is the impacts of early farming in the arid Western Mediterranean. Sarah's talk today is titled The Role of Cooperation in the Establishment and Management of Translocated Livestock, a Case from Neolithic Dalmatia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is this working? Is this working? Is this working? There we go. All right, thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to take a little bit of a departure from the papers that we've heard so far this afternoon, because I want to start with something that is much more in the present, perhaps, than what I would typically do. And the reason for this is, as Alicia mentioned in her introduction, I'm interested in the complex interplays between human social systems as well as environments and how that plays out over long periods of time. I'm particularly focused in on the effects of translocations on landscapes and how those translocations created new kinds of landscapes that set the stage for human social organizations and shifts through time. But I'm also interested on the effects of translocations on the animals themselves. So to put this into a broader perspective, agrobiodiversity today is really heavily emphasizes localized breeds. So many of you may be familiar with various plant storage, seed storage facilities to help secure the future of agricultural production and that diversity for the future. And one way that we can do this with animals is by looking at localized breeds. Now, there are over 8,000 breeds of domesticated animals on the planet today that are used in agricultural and food production. Most of these, the big five, are cattle, sheep, chickens, goats, and pigs. But of these over 8,700 breeds, the vast majority, almost, or over 7,000, almost 8,000 of them, are local breeds. And these are breeds that are recorded in only one country on the planet. And many of these local breeds are actually very specific to particular areas of these countries. When we look at this in terms of sort of the modern information that we have about these breeds, what we find is, and I'm going to shift this over here for just a second, what we find is that the United Nations, who does censuses of these domestic livestock breeds, has found some pretty, what I think is shocking information, in that most of what we know about these big five livestock breeds is really limited to a fairly small number of breeds themselves. We have very limited data genetically on most of the economically important breeds on the planet. The ones that we have very good information on are the ones that are the most productive in industrialized agricultural practices. And in addition to the lack of genetic data, even where we have genetic data, we have very limited information on that relationship between genotypes and phenotypes, or the performances that can be expressed. And this is not systematically understood. This is something that Mindy Zeter referred to yesterday in terms of the incredible genetic diversity that's there, how some genes are expressed in some certain situations and not in others, and the roles that humans and human niche construction play in that expression of that DNA. Furthermore, not only do we not know much about the genetic diversity of these breeds that we know are highly localized, but we also know that many of them are going extinct, have gone extinct. There are estimates that over 100 livestock breeds have become extinct in the last 15 years. But I want to also point out on this, oh no, there we go. There it is. On this lower graph here, the status of the world's livestock breeds, if you look at this legend, the light gray is unknown. So if you look at the size of these bars, there are so many of these localized breeds where we don't even know what their status is today in terms of how large their herds are or how secure they are for future generations. So the reason why I'm interested in localized breeds is because localized breeds are an offshoot of both natural selection pressures in the translocation of breeds into new areas. There is natural selection there, as well as human intervention. This can be decisions that breeders make on what kinds of traits they want to promote within their herds. This can also be sort of happenstance, where management styles create conditions for certain characteristics to come out. And it's a combination of natural selection, this human intervention, as well as time that plays a role in the establishment of localized breeds. Now, why are these localized breeds important? Well, because most of them, especially the older ones, are highly adapted to the landscapes in which they are found today. This includes breeds that have that are resistant to parasites or diseases, such as the Ndama cattle, breeds such as the Gulf Coast sheep that are highly adapted to very hot and humid environments. And if you can make out here, they actually don't have any wool on their bellies, legs, or heads, and that's part of that adaptation to these hot and humid environments. Or things like Texas Longhorns, which have a really fascinating ecological history, in that they didn't always have long horns. They actually had very short horns when they were introduced by Spaniards into Mexico. They went feral, and the horns re-emerged as likely part of the crypto DNA that was still there once they were no longer under management. What's important about the Texas Longhorn is that they almost went extinct in the early 20th century due to the vagaries of economic systems and the desire for more fatty meats. And it was only a small group of ranchers that retained herds of longhorns during this period. And then in the 1950s, they started increasing again as market forces wanted to have more lean, grass-fed beef, as opposed to the fattier beef cuts that were popular earlier in time. Today, Texas Longhorns are actually doing quite well, but one of the reasons why they're doing quite well is because they are highly adapted to the hot and arid environments in southern Texas, as well as elsewhere in that part of the world. And they're used as genetic repositories to help create other breeds of cattle for dealing with things like future climate change and the models that are predicted for various parts of the southern United States. So what does this all have to do with archaeology? Well, my colleagues and I have been working in Dalmatia on the Croatian coast for the last several years, looking at the introduction of livestock and management practices through time. And this is work that I've done in particular together with Emil Podruk, who's at the Šibenik City Museum. And what we find here is that during the Neolithic, in this time period, which spans from about 8,000 years ago to just about 6,500 years ago or so, we have a series of villages, full-time agropastoralist villages, that dot the landscape. There are many villages that are in sight of one another. And as is typical for this time period in this part of the world, there are divisions between the early, the middle, and the late Neolithic that are most clearly identifiable in the ceramics, as well as some in the lithics. But really, it's the ceramics that provide sort of our chronological signposts. What we were able to do over the past couple of years is look at and analyze faunal remains from a number of these Neolithic sites spanning this whole time period, this about 1,500 years of cultural developments. And not surprisingly, for anybody who's ever looked at any faunal assemblages in the Mediterranean, we have a lot of sheep and goat. But we also see that there are some changes in the proportion of cattle and pigs through time. And what we've argued recently in print is that there are clear shifts in management strategies throughout the Neolithic. So just to summarize, we have, in the early Neolithic, lots of sheep and goat, lots of caprins at these sites, with increases in the middle Neolithic here, increases in cattle and a little bit in pigs. And then the late Neolithic, we currently only have one excavated late Neolithic site, Velishtak, that has a very strikingly different sort of picture of the livestock assemblage, in that there is much more cattle as well as much more pig than any time earlier in this region. In addition, we were able to do all sorts of typical zooarchaeological analyses where we're looking at age profiles of caprins at these different time periods, and using standard zooarchaeological techniques, we end up making the argument that in the early Neolithic, we have mostly sheep and goat husbandry with older animals that indicate a focus mostly on meat. We have some residue analyses on pottery that indicates that there's some dairying going on, although not very much. In the Middle Neolithic, it's actually very similar in some of the sites, but one site in particular is distinctive in that we have more mortality profiles at the site of Pokrovnik that suggest dairying. And this is distinctive from the other villages in this area. This is actually the same site also where we have these residues from in the ceramics in the Middle Neolithic that clearly show dairying activity as well as cheese production. So this was really interesting to us. We kind of glommed onto this and we're like, wow, look at this. We have a change in farming practices here with an intensification likely of animal husbandry. And then in the late Neolithic, we have this sort of strange thing that happens. There seems to be some pretty fundamental changes where we have many more cattle, we have more pigs than any time previously, we have zero evidence for dairying, all of our sheep and goats are old, and it seems very different than what we had seen previously. And when we look at other aspects of the archaeological record, we can see that this time period in the Middle Neolithic, there seems to be something interesting going on, where there is a reorganization of farming that's seen in the plant harvesting. So this is work that Nico Mazzucco and colleagues have done, looking at changes in harvesting practices. There's also some preliminary data using stable isotopes on seeds that indicate there's likely manuring occurring during this period where there wasn't before. And we have this evidence for dairying as well. And don't worry, Mindy, I'm not going to talk about dairying all that much because I'm kind of tired of it too. So the question that I now have is, what does site-based variation mean? What does it mean when we have one site in the Middle Neolithic that is distinctive from other sites? Does it mean that the people of Pokrovnik dairied and nobody else did? Or could there be something else behind that? Traditionally, archaeological approaches will focus on village-level activities, especially regarding livestock herding. And what I find interesting, and something that I'm still grappling with, is that there are known issues with sample sizes and mortality profiles that have been published on, that people have read, and I think I included choose to ignore because I am an optimist that our sample sizes should be big enough to be able to say big things. In addition, there are a number of other issues with zooarchaeological data, as well as some of my colleagues presented. I and I'm just going to throw this out there, I believe that as zooarchaeologists, we have not dealt with a zooarchaeological paradox in the way that our human osteology colleagues perhaps have, and that there are problems of equifinality, there are problems about presumed notions of behavior. So if you have lots of dead lambs, does that mean that people are milking? There's not necessarily a direct corollary, and yet most, or at least many, zooarchaeologists would say yes, which I suggested too. Although we do have the residues, so at least we have that, another proxy. And there are presumed notions of comparability between different sites in different regions, that certain patterns in faunal assemblages in one place are, mean the same as those elsewhere. So what I want to turn to now is work that, that is more recent and that has really informed my thinking and my struggles that I'm currently going through a little bit of an analytical identity crisis, I think. And that has to do with scale and strategy in agropastoral settings. And I put "and some dumb luck" in there because I think fundamentally we all know, and somebody in this room also wrote a whole book on it, that agropastoral systems are risky, right? There are bad years for farming. And in addition to that, there's been some interesting work, I think, both in ethnography as well as using historical sources to look at some of that variation and variability. So this includes ethnography, ecological modeling, and agent-based modeling, which we heard from Stephanie about yesterday. What many of these studies suggest is that herd size thresholds, in order to have a healthy herd, actually herds have to be quite large. And in the absence of having large herds, you're required to actually pool resources with others. There are inherent risks in small-scale agropastoralism, particularly where livestock is concerned. So one of these studies, the agent-based model, is Mark Moritz and colleagues modeled this. They modeled what would a cattle herd need to look like in order for it to survive. And one of the things that they found was general minimal herd sizes of at least 50, preferably 100, to even have a chance of likely surviving for more than a few years. They write, the smaller the starting herd size, the greater the risk of herd death. And actually in this paper that is written in part to inform government organizations, they write, don't bother giving people 50 head of cattle. You may as well give them a lottery ticket and they'd be better off. In work that Martin Welker and I have done, we looked at census data from over 2,500 agropastoral households in Nova Scotia and the Maritimes that date to the 18th century, where we had census data with not only the names of individual households and how many people were there, but how many animals they had. And what we found was that herds were dangerously close to collapse. That first of all, villages were pooling their herds, and second of all, even when they were pooling them, they were dangerously close to collapse. So much so that when Mark read our paper, he contacted me and he's like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what we're seeing today among pastoralists in Africa. So when we take these ideas and we go back to the archaeological record, I thought, okay, so maybe my variation in my archaeological sites actually is completely meaningless. Maybe I need to look at this more regionally and smoosh it all together, which is what that the graph on the right is. And we can see still general trends in increases in cattle and decline in sheep and goats in the caprins. But when we think about what that variation then means, perhaps we need to start thinking about it in a different kind of way, where the site level variation that we see in the Neolithic, even if it's real, we see it, we identify it, but perhaps it's because of different reasons. Perhaps this is where certain cooperative activities are occurring at one location and people are then going back to their home villages. Similarly, the shifts that we see in the late Neolithic, perhaps they are a response to herd collapse. Perhaps people are shifting away from the caprins because there are other options and opportunities there for them to focus in on their livestock. Or perhaps they're responses to other things, to other cultural or environmental factors. So this is all, these are all questions that we didn't start out with, but we're definitely going to be pursuing more in the future. So when we think about Neolithic faunal assemblages, we know that largely sedentary farming societies face a number of constraints. They face labor constraints, space constraints, mobility constraints, and these in turn put on limitations as to the size of herds that households can support. There have been others that have talked about the importance of herd pooling and cooperative management, livestock trading, and some have really good data for them, and some have just talked about it. And some of this has been as early as, 30 years ago. And yet, it still hasn't become a fundamental notion and a fundamental question that zooarchaeologists working in these kinds of contexts have been asking. And I would say that this is particularly important in contexts where we have translocations of species, where we know that the starting off herds are limited. So the variation that we see may have more to do with practices of livestock management as opposed to differences in livestock management between groups. And just to bring this back full circle, I'm almost done. Okay. Am I good? Okay, good. I am good. No. So just to bring this back full circle, these are specifically, these management practices and these organizations are the baselines for breed development in the past. And we, I would argue, can look at this archaeologically. One way that we could assess this is by focusing more on diachronic regional scales. Over the course of the last couple of days, there's been a lot of sort of pulsing between general issues and more particularistic contexts. And I think this is one area where we can look at more particularistic, there we go, contexts of regional studies, where we can then think about multiple proxies that we can use to address this, including ancient DNA, but not limited to ancient DNA, because we know that the DNA will only tell us part of the story. We also need the zooarchaeology, we need the morphology, and we need some geochemistry in that as well. And the ultimate goal that I see of this is to better understand agrobiodiversity today and what factors contribute to its development. And how we can actually inform conservation and policy decisions for the future using this kind of knowledge. And why is this important? Well, I think all of us, especially after the last couple of years, are even more sensitive to issues of food security and availability, and to the environmental challenges that we face today as a society, as well as those facing forward. In Dalmatia, we have 8,000 years of domesticated grazers and browsers that have been on that landscape. It is a highly anthropomorphic or anthropogenic landscape that has been partially defined throughout most of the Holocene by livestock. At the same time, in Dalmatia, we have a lot of depopulation of the rural and hinterlands since the mid-20th century. That was even accelerated by the war in the 1990s. These days, we have a lot of tourism on the coasts. It's mostly limited to the coasts. The interior areas were under mines, landmines, for a good chunk of, the last 30 years, 20 years. Many of these landmines have been now cleared, but still the people and the animals have not yet returned. So this has led to a number of environmental issues that have arisen about conservation and the notion of rewilding. And do I really have a few more minutes? Okay, good. Thank you. So why is this important? Because Europe decided that we really need to rewild all the wild places. And in Dalmatia, the way that this is happening is through aurochs. So there is a group called Toros. These guys, the Toros program, that's out of the Netherlands. They are in cahoots with Rewilding Europe, which is in cahoots with most of the national parks in Europe, including in Croatia, including in the Velebit. And what the Toros project has done is has decided that the aurochs is Europe's defining animal and that it needs to be backbred. And so they have been doing this now for the last 15 years, 20 years or so. And they introduced aurochs to the Velebit, so to a national park in the Dinaric Alps right here in northern Dalmatia. 2 different herds in 2014 and 2016. These aurochs are there. You can go see them. And they look nice. Supposedly they've bred them so that they're not mean the way aurochs, what we know of them are, that they're actually nice aurochs. But they are there. Now, as a zooarchaeologist and as an archaeologist, I heard about this and I contacted my archaeology colleagues and I'm like, what is going on here? And they had no idea that this was happening. When we look at the archaeological record, the last documented aurochs in Croatia is from the Bronze Age, so about 5,000 years ago. In Dalmatia, we don't know when the last aurochs was there. We don't have any record of aurochs. What we do know about European aurochs, based on analyses from other places, is that they were a forest-dwelling species and not grasslands. And this is all in the service of ecological management, right, and landscape services. And what's particularly surprising about this, and I should say it's not just aurochs, they've also introduced horses, wild horses from Lithuania into the same area, also in the name of landscape services. But what I find most concerning about this is that there are some potentially interesting alternatives for conservation, and that is this little guy here. This is a Busha cattle. Now, Busha are what are known locally as an indigenous breed, or they're a highly localized breed of cattle. They are found in Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. They are about full grown. They're only about 1 meter high at the withers. They are known for their dairyings. They have a sort of rich fat milk that they produce. They're also very tasty in terms of meat. There are small herds of Busha. They're still kept in mountainous areas such as in Lika, which, by the way, is very close to where the aurochs were introduced. But there is little economic incentive for farmers to keep Busha, because everybody, if you're going to have a dairy cattle, you need a Jersey, you need one that will produce the quantities of milk that the economics requires. But at the same time, these Busha are highly adapted to this particular part of the world. They actually will forage more like a goat. They do very well in marginal environments, and they are very disease resistant for the weather patterns in the Velebit region. They are late maturing, but they can breed into their 20s, right? So they are very potentially long-lived, and they have good fertility as well. Now, my colleague and former student, Emily Zavodny, and I, we got interested in Busha because Emily was working on Bronze Age sites in the Lika area, close to where these aurochs and the Busha are. And what she was finding was much, much smaller cattle than what we had from the Neolithic. And this started getting us thinking about, well, are we seeing the beginnings of breed development where we have introduced translocated species that are adapting to these new environments and that are potentially the predecessors of the Busha? The Busha is known to be a descendant of what the Romans called the Illyrian cattle, which are these, so we know that they go back several thousand years, but they may have actually been one of the first breeds ever in this area. So what I want to sort of finish up with is that through thinking about agrobiodiversity and the role that archaeology can play, I would argue that by establishing ecological histories and describing and understanding the niche construction and the ecological services of domesticated animals in these areas, we have an opportunity to look at questions that are significant to populations today in the area, as well as to future generations moving forward who are concerned about the future of agrobiodiversity, as well as food availability through time, while at the same time, we can then talk about and analyze the social and environmental impacts of these migrations and translocations and economies through time. So what I guess I want to end with is, we have an opportunity by looking at the ecological histories of translocated species that far extends beyond what is perhaps a nice study in, a scientific study in one particular area, but that can actually have real world implications for the future. So with that, before I stop, I do want to acknowledge UMMAA. And in particular, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and for putting on such a wonderful conference. I also want to say just about myself that I am, while I did not go here, I am the recipient of socially transmitted generational wisdom. So my advisor was Mike Jokum, a proud graduate of this program, as well as Mindy Zeter, who not only advised me and mentored me and continues to advise me and mentor me, but she actually was the one who got me into archaeology when I was a teenager. So thank you again for that, Mindy. I am thrilled to have been, to be a part of the intellectual legacy of this institution. But I am equally thrilled by what I have seen and experienced here the last couple of days. And the future of this institution is very, very bright from where I stand. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. And we got to see the baby cows. That's like the most important part of every presentation. Little mini cows. Okay, so we have one more speaker in our session. Dr. Lindsay Montgomery is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and the Center for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto, a position that she just took up, so she's gonna be a lot closer to Michigan. She's an anthropological archaeologist whose work seeks to create complex counter-histories focused on Indigenous persistence, resistance, and survivance in the North American West. Her work particularly focuses on the material and social histories of equestrian communities living in the Southwest and Great Plains from the 16th to 20th centuries. In her research, Lindsay employs a collaborative and multidisciplinary approach which brings together archaeological, archival, oral historical, and ethnographic sources to understand interethnic interactions among Indigenous peoples and with European settlers. Her current research revolves around a collaborative research project with Piqueras Pueblo in northern New Mexico. This work explores the evolving social and economic relationship between the Pueblo, other Pueblo communities, and Jicaro Apache and Hispano settlers through an investigation of agricultural practices. Her talk today is titled Native Science, Replacing Indigenous Worldview in Archaeological Research on Domestication in North America.
All right. Yeah. All right, thank you everybody for sticking around till the end. So my intellectual connection to Michigan is through Dr. Severin Fowles, who is my PhD supervisor and who is a co-PI with me on the Pickeries project, along with Mike Adler, another Michigan alumni, who were both trained by the great Dick Ford, who really kind of set the stage, in my opinion, for working with indigenous communities in a kind of ethically engaged but rigorous way here in the Southwest, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to take our panel in a little bit of a different direction. And I'm going to start actually with a provocative question that was posed by Brian Boyd in his 2017 annual review article. So Boyd poses this question of, can archaeology's traditional big questions around kind of human-animal relations be successfully articulated without drawing on frameworks that privilege humans? So Boyd's question is really a response to these kind of deeply rooted forms of anthropocentrism and nature-culture dualisms, which have shaped a lot of the traditional approaches to domestication in archaeology. These approaches tend to prioritize stability rather than change, and they often present really simplified, kind of human-centered understandings of causality. So over the past 20 years or so, there's been a robust body of scholarship that's really directly critiqued these kind of embedded forms of anthropocentrism and dualisms within a broad range of kind of Western scientific frameworks. For instance, we can look to the work of Donna Haraway, who's drawn on these kind of eco-feminist frameworks to really draw attention to multidimensionality of the natural, as well as people like Bruno Latour and actor network theory, where he's really trying to expand our understanding to include non-human agency. In a 2012 article, Melinda Zetter outlines the impact of some of these critiques on zooarchaeology in particular, with many scholars embracing kind of mutualistic approaches that examine how plants and animals and humans respond reciprocally to domestication processes. As Boyd points out, this body of kind of critical scholarship has really spurred a more social approach to archaeological analyses of domestication, which is really focused on kind of multi-species hybrid communities, questions of ritual, as we saw earlier, and questions of symbolism. So as Métis scholar Zoe Todd has observed, this growing body of kind of critical research has done a lot of important work in terms of decentering humans and challenging dualisms, but it has not taken seriously indigenous perspectives and scientific knowledge that can inform these types of conversations. So in the time that I have today, I want to take Zoe Todd's critique, and I want to apply it to Brian Boyd's question about how we might think about reframing studies of domestication. So specifically, I want to draw on the work of Gregory Cadigi, who's a Santa Clara Pueblo tribal member, and his concept of native science, which offers one kind of culturally grounded alternative that archaeologists can draw on in trying to develop a new kind of paradigm. So rather than looking for causal associations, native science emphasizes non-human agency, interconnections, landscapes, places, and kind of cycles. So these four concepts can be used to reframe domestication as a set of cooperative, multi-species relationships which unfold over time within an ongoing set of broader processes. Native science also works to replace domestication on the landscape, situating these kind of relational processes with specific culturally and ecologically constructed places. So before I talk more about Cadigi's concept of native science and how we might apply it, I'll just give a brief kind of overview of how anthropocentrism and nature-culture dualisms have shaped archaeological studies of domestication and how these frameworks in particular have impacted indigenous peoples in negative ways. So in their 2007 article, Jay Johnson and Brian Merton traced the nature-culture divide to the scientific revolution of the 18th century Europe. During this time, scholars like Carl Linnaeus began to observe and classify plants and animals and to start to describe in kind of systematic ways the world's geography. This was largely an asocial project, which systematically excluded humans, both indigenous peoples and Europeans. However, indigenous peoples and knowledge occupies a particularly uncomfortable position within this kind of emerging nature-culture binary. On the one hand, indigenous people were seen as primitives, living in a kind of state of nature, and really lacking the ability to truly master the land. While indigenous people were part of nature, their knowledge of the natural world was resoundingly excluded from these kind of Linnaean projects of cataloging, separating, and classifying. The result has been this kind of persistent exclusion of indigenous knowledge and philosophy from studies of both cultural systems and the natural world, of which the study of domestication is really at the nexus. The notion that domestication marked the complete mastery of humans over the natural world is an outgrowth of this kind of artificial separation of humans from nature and has fueled these kind of anthropocentric interpretations of human-environment interactions. So during the 19th century, early anthropologists like Lewis Henry Morgan built these kind of racialized theories of history that saw human mastery over nature through cultivation as the gateway towards Western civilization and social complexity in all sorts of material forms like settlements, technological advancements, monumental architecture, art, religion, writing, you can name them. In ancient society, Morgan drew on observations of indigenous communities in North America to develop these types of unilineal theories of social evolution. In essence, Morgan was arguing that cultivation was this kind of imaginary sociological hurdle, which human societies were kind of driving towards. So this link between plant domestication, the formation of settled villages, and the development of complexity really reflects this kind of linear understanding of history, which sees each of these kind of social facets as threshold events along an evolutionary pathway. This approach to history creates a kind of path dependency, which excludes alternative subsistence models and social relationships from discussions of complex societies. As Michel Levlier has argued, the relationship between subsistence and social evolution in particular has had long-lasting effects on the subdiscipline of archaeology. So within contemporary archaeological discourse, assumptions of mastery and their lingering ties to social evolution has tended to reinforce kind of rigid conceptual divisions between foraging and farming lifeways. As a result, co-convening practices of wild plant harvesting are often excluded from studies of subsistence among agricultural societies like Pueblo communities in the North American Southwest. When wild plant use is discussed in these contexts, it's often framed as evidence of proto-agriculture, a sort of kind of intermediary step along the pathway towards sedentism and complexity. The exclusion of non-domesticates from these kind of discussions of indigenous agricultural societies creates this unnecessarily simple portrait of subsistence practices in the past, which don't reflect the multifaceted nature of human-environment interactions. 20th century ethnographic data from the likes of Frank Cushing and others among Pueblo communities provides really clear evidence that domestication definitely didn't mark the end of foraging practices. For instance, rabbit bush, which is depicted here, is a non-domesticated plant species common throughout the Southwest, and it was used specifically by Hopi peoples to identify areas with substantial groundwater and thus areas where agriculture might be possible. Similarly, there's a growing evidence from complex subsistence systems at pickeries, which include both domestication and foraging. So while it's clear from the large number of agricultural features myself, Mike Adler, Sev have recorded at pickeries, that the community itself was engaging in kind of complex, multifaceted forms of agriculture from the 13th century onward in really intensive ways. But we also see at pickeries continued importance of other types of harvesting practices. So conversations with our tribal liaison, Richard Bermejo, indicate that foraging for high altitude wild plants, as well as what Richard calls harvesting wild game, particularly bison, was a really important part of Piccary's kind of economic life. So these analogies reflect the potential that a native science framework might hold for expanding our understandings of the various pathways that indigenous communities followed in managing the landscape and building resiliency over time. The anthropocentric frameworks and these kind of nature-culture dualisms embedded in traditional archaeological approaches to domestication can be tied directly to colonial policies targeting indigenous lands. This connection is summarized nicely by Ade Romero Briones, a Cochiti and Kiowa tribal member who is the director of the agricultural program for the First Nations Development Institute. So as Briones notes, colonial policymakers looking to rationalize their efforts to claim indigenous lands on the behalf of white civilization drew directly on the ideas of Morgan, as well as much earlier legal documents like the Law of Nations, which equated civilization with mastery over nature through cultivation. Such frameworks directly informed things like the U.S. Homestead Act passed in 1862, which granted all adult Euro-American citizens who had not borne arms against the government the right to claim 160 acres of surveyed territory under the stipulation that they directly improve that land through cultivation. Reflecting on this kind of colonial history, Briones goes on to argue for a decolonizing approach to agriculture that critically examines our frameworks around domestication and indigenous dispossession. So building on Briones' critique, I want to suggest that embracing native science is one way in which archaeologists can practice what Gail Canella and Catherine Manueletto have called anti-colonial science. So anti-colonial science is part of a kind of eco-feminist decolonizing project, which seeks to accomplish three goals. One, to reveal and actively challenge social systems, discourses, and institutions that are oppressive. To support knowledge that has been discredited by dominant powers and their orientations. And to construct activist conceptualizations of research that are critical in ways that are transparent. So, according to Kadagi, native science is a kind of eco-philosophical approach to the interrelationship between indigenous peoples and nature, and provides a framework for understanding natural diversity, optimization, cooperation, niche construction, self-regulation, change, connectedness, all of the big things that archaeologists are often interested in. From an archaeological perspective, what is notable about Kadagi's conceptualization of native science is the fact that he posits a kind of mutualistic relationship between humans, plants, and animals, as well as the broader natural world, and that he emphasizes the centrality of places, in particular in human-environment interactions. So the centrality of non-human agency to native science, along with its emphasis on relationality, offers a kind of alternative set of assumptions with which to think about domestication, which moves us beyond frameworks that have disenfranchised indigenous peoples as a result of their entanglements with colonial conquest and Western science. So a key premise of native science is the notion that all things are animate, meaning that all things have a kind of life force or energy. Another kind of key principle within native science is that everything exists in relation to each other and are therefore interconnected. Archaeologists can draw on these kind of two principles to really reframe the way we think about domestication as the product of a cooperative set of relations between humans, non-humans, and other than human beings. For instance, we can turn to Todd's work again. She wrote an article in 2014 called Fish Pluralities, which draws on our research among the Palatuk and demonstrates the kind of intriguing analytical potentials of using indigenous epistemologies as literal sources with which to understand dynamic relationships across species. Another key principle of native science is that indigenous people have a history in place, and that places on the landscape are sacred and connected. In this sense, native science encourages archaeologists to create kind of deep histories of domestication on the land. The importance of place and landscapes within indigenous thought is now a well-accepted facet of archaeological research in North America, although it's often cited in reference to the work of Keith Basso rather than to indigenous philosophers. Over 20 years before Keith Basso wrote Wisdom Sits in Places, Vine Deloria Jr. outlines the spatial approach to history embedded in the worldviews of indigenous communities. In God is Red, Deloria contrasts the importance of space in indigenous philosophy with the centrality of events, what he calls the philosophy of time, in Western thought. The great deal of archaeological scholarship that's really centered on identifying the exact origins and timing of domestication events is one manifestation of this kind of philosophy of time, which is embedded in a lot of archaeological thought. A place-based approach to domestication draws our attention towards these kind of long-term processes of land use in specific ecological niches. For instance, Kurt Anschwitz done a lot of work with Tewa agricultural practices in the Rio Grande, which really demonstrates that indigenous peoples were deliberately selecting certain plant varieties in specific local environments for modification. The important role of place in shaping these types of human-environment interactions is, of course, not entirely unique to native science. It's also reflected in theories of localized adaptation used in more traditional archaeological studies. Theories of localized adaptation view human-driven domestication as a response to uncertainty and volatility in production cycles. Within this model, managing a wide range of plant types across different ecological zones or places becomes a way of buffering against crop failure. In contrast, native science proposes harmony, a desire to maintain a kind of dynamic balance between all relations as the driving mechanism of place-based adaptation rather than risk management. So it's a shift in how we think about explaining these kind of causal mechanisms. Taking up the concept of harmony leads to new interpretations of material practices associated with domestication and subsistence much more broadly. For instance, Chatterjee argues that the development and adoption of new technologies is inherently conservative and based on care to ensure that those technologies don't disrupt the ecological balance. So this kind of promotes a concept of slow adaptation, which is particularly poignant in thinking through the shift towards intensive agriculture in the northern Rio Grande in particular. So while maize cultivation in the Rio Grande occurs around the same time as basically everywhere else in the Southwest, about 1000 BC, indigenous foraging practices continue to dominate subsistence cycles for a much longer period in the north, roughly until about the 12th, even into the 13th century. Maxine McBrien and Bradley Vieira have referred to this kind of continuity of hunting and gathering practices, as well as the stone tool technologies associated with them, as resistant foraging. So the term resistant foraging assumes that the adoption of agriculture was inevitable and that indigenous people were resisting this pull to adopt sedentism and cultivation. The concept of resistant foraging also reflects this kind of persistent, although often not explicitly acknowledged belief that lifestyle is directly related to social complexity. So if we turn to a native science framework, however, this kind of slow adoption of agriculture, along with the continuation of these kind of robust foraging practices in the northern Rio Grande appears less like resistance and more as a kind of logical byproduct of a conservative approach rooted in maintaining balance. Finally, native science is grounded by an alternative approach to temporality, one centered upon the concept of cycles rather than linear trajectories. In Indian thinking in a linear world, Muskogee Creek scholar Donald Fixico argues that while Western scientific thought is based on understanding the causal relationships between two forces, Indian thinking is framed in terms of cycles and circles of relatedness across humans, animals, plants, the natural environment, and the metaphysical world. The indigenous philosophy of cycles articulates with some emerging theories of domestication that we've begun to see in bioarchaeology, which have reframed human-animal relations in terms of process philosophy. A focus on process or cycles pushes archaeological inquiry away from issues of origins and these kind of singular causal mechanisms, and instead prompts us to consider domestication as a series of dynamic, networked interactions. From a data standpoint, archaeologists drawing on a kind of native science framework can turn to a variety of different sources as evidence of this kind of place-based, long-term, human-environment interaction. As Kataji points out, native science is conveyed in stories told by indigenous people and is embedded in indigenous languages themselves. The oral tradition really archives experiential facts about nature and history that are woven together with metaphors, not as metaphors. So for instance, Hopi oral histories tell about how Masuyu, a caretaker of the earth, first presented the Hopi with the gift of corn after their emergence from the underworld. This gift included a bag of seeds, a planting stick, a gourd filled with water. And within these kind of Hopi oral traditions, the domestication of corn is inextricably tied to their emergence from the underworld in a specific place near the Grand Canyon. To date, most archaeological studies of domestication have largely ignored these sorts of narratives as sources of data. They've dismissed this knowledge as metaphorical rather than factual, or they've questioned the validity of trying to apply oral traditions to deep histories. Embracing native science as an interpretive framework requires archaeologists to actually use these oral histories, like the Hopi story of maize, as a framework for interpreting material evidence. In this case, the planting stick and the water gourd might be reframed or reinterpreted as not simply evidence for the development of early farming strategies, but as part of a larger history of Hopi becoming. In addition to the oral tradition, indigenous scientific knowledge is embedded within the material record itself. This includes more obvious lines of evidence like water management features, as well as more untraditional sources like iconography, carved into rocks, clay, birch bark, hides, and structures. Iconography offers a particularly valuable type of archive, which can be used by scholars to understand the kind of shifting logics in land use practices and human-plant-animal relations. So, to shout out Sev again, through an extensive study of rock art in the Rio Grande, Sev has shown that there's a notable correlation between the widespread adoption of agriculture during the 11th through 12th century and a shift in iconography away from abstract depictions and towards the representation of animals and human bodies. This stylistic change likely reflects a kind of shifting logic of image depiction linked to the documentation of specific types of ecological knowledge around plant and animal management. This finding offers kind of intriguing possibilities around the use of rock art as a new source for understanding and documenting domestication processes in particular places over time. So, in conclusion, I argue that embracing native science produces more complex, multi-causal accounts of domestication, which help us reframe non-human agents as mutualistic partners in these processes. A native science framework also pushes archaeological investigations of domestication beyond these questions of origins and towards more long-term and place-based lines of inquiry, which connect contemporary domestication practices to deeper histories of land use. And that's really key there. Finally, native science helps to resituate archaeological research in relation to the colonial project by providing a critical corrective to deeply embedded forms of anthropocentrism and dualisms, which have tended to exclude indigenous knowledge and have quite literally disenfranchised Native people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Okay, so maybe we could have everyone come down and sit up front.
Sit in order.
Okay, why don't we start with the audience? Does anyone have any questions for our speakers?
Okay. This is a commenty question. I apologize. So I was kind of linking the ideas of two of the presentations today. One of the things that I was getting from your presentation was about power, right? And you're talking about power. And Sarah, you're also in a way kind of talking about these 8,000 years of way you're expressing yourself in the landscape. So my commenty question is, when we're thinking about the ways that people show themselves on the landscape, in the Northwest Coast, some folks like Ian McKechnie and Colin Greer have talked about the middens of shells that Coast Salish and other peoples have that kind of show that we have always been here on the landscape. And I was kind of wondering if your presentations of looking at the ways that people have been there and how they're showing themselves with the tusks that you were showing, or a grazed landscape, if this is also part of that connection to landscape of we have always been here, that kind of power.
Sure, I'll say two things about that. One is, I think in the spirit of answers to questions, yes. But more seriously, I think the way, and like the last element I was talking about in terms of thinking about this framework, which concerns how it is that people are engaging with the natural world around them. I mean, this I think relates very much to what Lindsay was just saying. The way in which people engage with the natural world around them in ways that are socially meaningful within a social context is something that we can observe in all sorts of different ways. And that recognizing that that's a means by which interpersonal relations are constructed and reified and changed is something that is, I guess, worthwhile thinking about. And I think it is a distinct aspect of the consideration of how power relations, to return to that issue, are constructed, activated, and made manifest. And I don't think it's the only way that we should be thinking about relationships between humans and the biosphere within which they live, but it's an important element if we're trying to understand social organization. So that's what your comment makes me reflect on.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's actually quite different in that what we know over the last 8,000 years in this place is that people have come and gone. There have been so many colonial events and so much movement of people of different ethnicities and I mean, just empires, various empires, multiple empires rising and collapsing and all of that, that I I don't see it as a, we've been always here. There's no we in that we've been always here. But the way that I conceptualize it more is the anthropogenic landscapes that are there that are sort of part of, or that have been part of human societies, regardless of who has been there. Because once agriculture is established in this area, it's there for good. That element these days is juxtaposed with notions of what a wild landscape should or could look like. So while there are ideas about, and real sort of environmental issues about depopulation and about not having animals on the landscape that have arisen, not the least of which is also fire. I mean, I'm in California, right? So we deal with fire and we think of fire, and fire is a big deal in the Mediterranean as well. And the lack of these grazing animals has had significant impacts on the severity of fires today. While that's happening, I think the question about power is sort of somewhere else. It becomes more how one imagines the landscape to be or what it should be, and sort of disjointing the so-called natural landscapes from those anthropogenic landscapes without recognizing that they've been anthropogenic landscapes for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So I think the power is situated in a slightly different area there.
This isn't going to be easy for me, but I can't resist. I lost my voice since yesterday, but I loved all the papers. And in particular, the last two papers really spoke to me with Lindsay. Your work on indigenous knowledge and native science is so complementary to the niche construction kind of approach that we're trying to take. And I think the basic message, can people really understand anything I'm saying? Okay, is that, it sounds worse than I feel, by the way, is that not only are we overprivileging humans, but we're overprivileging domesticates. And all of our studies of origins of agriculture and domestication fails to understand that they are an accidental outcome of this coming together of people, landscapes, and resources, in which resources have a lot to say about what happens to them. And that this combination has built long-term sustainable adaptations for all involved for long periods of time before domesticates, which are this sort of evil stepchild that comes out of this relationship, come to dominate it. So the questions really are, one, we need to be studying more the management, the co-management of landscapes by humans and the plants and animals. They come together, and finding ways to monitor that in the past. And not just focus on the genetic changes that make something into a chicken, but also in our explanations of why that then comes to dominate. Is it's not an outcome that is, thank God, the technology has finally prevailed because it was better than anything else. It's why did that sustainable system not survive in the face of that? And there are probably whole different social reasons rather than risk reduction or anything else that had something to do with that in multiple world areas. So I thought that was a lovely paper. And it really builds on so much of the work that I know of from Dick, and also the ethnobiology work and the tending the wild work. So I really loved the paper. And it's Sarah, again, you made the point. And I talked a little bit about this, is that so often in conservation and in ecological studies, people are always trying to look to natural environments without humans, and we want to go back to that before the human taint. And really, your point, especially in the Mediterranean, is those are all human landscapes. They've been human landscapes, and those are actually agricultural landscapes. And if you're going to do anything with conservation, it's going back to early breeds and then ways that sustainable way of managing that landscape is the way that you're going to conserve those landscapes. So all of you were wonderful papers, and I'm glad I got out of my bed to come and listen to them.
I have a question that actually relates to Mindy's comments to some extent, and also to your paper, Lindsay. But it's a question for Sarah. And I really appreciated the emphasis on the reframing of domestication as a kind of multi-species relationship. And it reminds me of work that I know that's being done by Dale and Grindle in Wyoming amongst elk, and the management of elk and ecological examination of elk behavior and how that relates to management and human elk relationships. And it relates to a question that I had that came up in Sarah's talk, which is, you had a slide up there that listed 8,774 breeds of domesticated animals, right? Which is a pretty precise number, particularly given that when the slides that you were showing of certain species there's a whole bunch of we don't knows going on there. And so I was wondering if you could just, for one thing, say a little bit where that word comes from, but then how animals like elk or the so-called semi-domesticates or tamed taxa that don't fit into traditional approaches to the domestication question when not thought of through the lens of the this kind of more multi-species relationship angle. How does that fit into this narrative, that number, and then this discussion of breed loss and breed sustenance and land races and all that sort of thing?
So that number comes from the United Nations Agriculture Group. Forgot FOA. There we go. And so it's based on international surveys that they've done, and that's just the number that's out there in their publications. So the reality of it is that there may be more, but those were the breeds that were actually captured. And what's along those lines, I think it's quite fascinating when you go to some of the big agricultural schools websites. They'll have lists of localized breeds where they're like trying to public source information on them. So you can go to, I think it was Iowa has a really extensive one, and they'll have the name of a breed, but they won't have any other information about them because they just know that they exist, but they don't even have a photo of them, let alone any other kinds of information. So that's where that number comes from, and that's specifically from groups within the United Nations that have been looking at agricultural practices and sustainability, and trying to figure out where some of the weak spots are. And so when you have part of that graph, like we don't know anything about the genetics of those breeds, right? That's where that comes from. In terms of other types that are not part of that, they're rarely discussed within those contexts. And I appreciated your paper a lot, Lindsay, too, because I think that, as Mindy also reiterated, they are integral to these agricultural systems in really fundamental ways. I didn't talk about it in here, but we part of the faunal story that we have from the Neolithic, these are farmers that are moving in from other places, likely from Italy. They're settling in these areas. They're fully committed to agriculture, and 10% of the faunal assemblage are wild resources. We know that they're hunting. We have the plant remains, and most of the plant remains are domesticated remains, right? So lots of wheat and barley and that kind of stuff. But there's like the odd Cornelian cherry and the odd whatever within those remains. But we know nothing about microbotanicals. Nobody's done that work, and where they have done that work in Neolithic Europe, they're finding starch grains from all sorts of things that we can't even identify because nobody knows what they are, and there aren't the comparative collections there for it. So I think realistically, we are missing an entire side of these highly sustainable practices in the archaeological record that speaks directly to what you were saying as well. So I hope that answered your question, sort of.
Add, because my paper was cited, is that it seems like for a lot of our conversations that challenging of the wild and domestic is actually really key. Because if we start to think about these human-animal relations as networks of relations as opposed to categories of relations, we actually understand better subsistence systems as systems, right, as entire kind of practices. And for a lot of Pueblo communities, and particularly for piccaries, the bison are a great example of a single kind of species that defies categorization as a kind of domesticate versus a wild animal, but which becomes really central to how piccaries' ceremonial lives, piccaries' subsistence practices, and how those practices change over time in relationship to other indigenous groups, in which bison are also kind of existing in these networks, as well as for Spanish and later Anglo-colonizers. So I think it helps us actually expand our interpretations to think about those relationships in a little bit broader ways.
I have a question for Lindsay. What's the indigenous perspective on the relationship between agriculture and sedentism? Because my young and naive understanding of the Pueblos back in Africa was that they were farmers, but they were not truly sedentary, not in the strictest sense.
Yeah.
They were maybe short-term sedentism. What's going on with that? Do you have any intel from?
Well, I'll say I'm not Pueblo, but you know, my kind of understanding and read on that question of what's the relationship between kind of sedentism as agriculture is that sedentism, as we think about Pueblo communities today, is really a byproduct of colonization, and that's a forced kind of being in place created by the mission system, which is not representative of how Pueblo people would have been in the past. And even during colonization and colonization today, Pueblo people are engaging in broad landscape use that doesn't just involve kind of sedentism in place. And I think you see that really nicely during the Pueblo Revolt, when you see indigenous communities actually going out onto the landscape and reclaiming and reusing all of these places that had been part of their broader kind of subsistence networks that had been kind of cut off to them by colonization. Yeah, so I think it's a kind of forced relationship that's a product of colonialism.
So I think I want to follow up a little bit on that and kind of ask a question about the categories that we use. And I think this really is inspired in part by what you presented, Lindsay, around native science and this idea of cyclical, and whether or not wild, domesticate, sedentary, mobile are actually meaningful categories in that kind of framework. Because I think about the example of the Texas Longhorns. Would be considered a domesticate, but when they went wild for a while, their horns regrew, they changed. And so is that actually a meaningful distinction, or would a relational approach open up different kinds of possibilities of imagining, you know, not so much these reified categories that we see as really a lineage from that sort of Linnaean categorization and taxonomies? So just a question for the panel.
Well, there we go. You know, thanks for that comment, because I think, you know, there is this association with agriculture and sedentism that is often portrayed, and yet I think all of us, and especially Alicia, knows that that is not, it's not a binary, or it's not a coupled thing, right? I mean, any kind of pastoral society, even agro-pastoral societies, we have evidence for transhumance that, starts off. So people are moving around the landscape. And one of the things that I was trying to argue is even within our village, our sedentary villages, I think they're pooling their management strategies. So they must be going back and forth and between each other. So at that point, how sedentary is it when you keep on moving around, right? That would be my response, but maybe you want to say something to that.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I dealt with a lot was that I was studying pastoralists who weren't doing agriculture, and I was saying they were settled. And everyone's like, no, they can't be. I'm like, well, just because their animals are moving around the site doesn't mean that they're moving very far. So like 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, is that nomadic? Not in my estimation. So, I think on both sides, we need to sort of like decouple the economy from mobility, from a lot of other things that it's sort of bound up with. And I think, taking new approaches can hopefully help with some of that, decoupling that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think it's really important in thinking about indigenous contexts in North America in particular, because of the way in which the discourse of mobility and the discourse of sedentism have been kind of activated as logics for displacing people simultaneously, right? So if you were considered mobile, if you had these wandering ways, as Thomas Jefferson used to say about indigenous people, that you therefore had no right to claim the land. And in the same breath, you could also say they were cultivating the land, but they weren't mastering it, and therefore they did not have a right to claim the land. So I think in the indigenous context in North America, it's politically charged to use those categories, and therefore it takes on this extra level that we need to really kind of deconstruct when we come up with these kind of theories and thinking about how we phrase things.
That's exactly what's happening in Kazakhstan. Exactly the same. It's like, oh, well, they're just wandering around, and so now we have to like control them. And so it's exactly the same. Like, oh, we can take that land because they're just wandering around, not really doing anything. So
I can add the agricultural component in Southeast Asia, where we've been looking at the evolutionary relationship between sweetening and intensive agriculture, when they think that if you have an irrigated, complex agricultural system, then they will abandon sweetening. But that's not what we see in Southeast Asia, where you have, at least in Ifugao, you have the landscape is dominated by rice terraces, but only 5% of the people eats rice. The rest, 95%, will get their carbohydrate from sweetened fields. And so it has implications on conservation programs on this UNESCO World Heritage Site. There's also the management of forests, which is part of that system, but we are focusing on rice and not on the other systems.
Can I ask a follow-up before we get to Tiffany, which is for Stephen, which is, do you have any sense that that redating the Ifugao terracing system and the processes that went into that might in some ways be a reaction to colonization pressures, not just in terms of the mechanics of the political economy, but also these types of issues of the reorganization of the landscape that's necessary in order to fit into a perception of a civilized people or of a community that the Spanish would then better understand. Is there any evidence of that? That type of same kind of dynamic about identification of people was going on.
It has, for the longest time, we were told, and I've read on our textbooks, that the rice terraces, the technology, were brought or came from Chinese 16th century Chinese pirates who were kicked out by the Spanish because they were threatened by the Chinese. But so it has something to do with juxtaposition of Christianized lowland Filipinos and the others who are savages still up in the mountains. And this was continued by the early American anthropologists who needed to justify using the highlands as like the frontier. So they've used it. So if you look at the concept of indigeneity in the Philippines, it's very much like celebrate the 4th of July. So they developed this kind of curriculum where everyone will be Americans, and then when we gain our independence, everyone will be Filipino. And so using this deep history to talk about differences and later assuming that as part of the larger status quo. Did I?
Well, mostly, but I'm wondering from the Ifugao point of view, do you think that there's any evidence that some of the stimulus for transforming the landscape had to do with a reaction to the Christian missionizing in the lowlands and an idea that by transforming the landscape, we are creating ourselves as a different sort of people that's more legible to the Spanish?
It is now part of the conversation, their identity that they are different from the lowlanders. But in our discussions, especially with community stories, the transformation has something to do with creating this space for rituals to solidify or to bring the community together. And so even though you have rice terraces with only 5% rice, the way the agriculture system works, where you have ritual every stage of the life cycle of rice, it becomes like the role of the religion to bring all of the communities together.
Alicia, I'm really cognizant of your 5 o'clock cutoff. So yeah, exactly. Rather than ask a question, maybe you'll let me leave a thought for consideration that maybe will generate some conversation over reception or something, right? And that is, it begins, I think, with a compliment, which is that I think for, on our first evening, we had a provocation about whether or not archaeology is producing theory worth writing home about right now. And I really see what you guys did in this panel as a great example of a shift from a concern with generalizable or universalizing theories, which really dominated a major portion of our theoretical history as a discipline, towards substantive theorizing and what it means to create ideas that are transferable given your social and environmental context, with respect to this phase, but that are importantly localized and not generalizable, right? And really using this this beautiful example of something like Domesticates and a concern for human-animal interaction as a way to highlight the utility of a more substantive approach to theorizing in our discipline. So I just really want to commend you guys on doing that here. And I guess then that the part that was going to be a question is just sort of about if we are creating then these transferable substantive theories of something like domestication, thinking to this morning's panel, for instance, and the sort of conversation about receding shorelines and other kinds of climatological changes and the very clear and obvious differences in the environmental context that you are all working in, right? How does that sort of shift the kinds of questions around a principle like domestication that we're dealing with? So, but but just like great job on some cool theorizing. So thanks.
I'll just respond to Tiffany really quick and say that concepts like resiliency, I think, become really important in thinking about how indigenous or communities in general, but particularly indigenous communities in North America, have approached domestication and human-animal, human-plant relationships over the long term. And it's really resiliency in the kind of empowering sense of this like slow adaptation that's centered on balance and harmony. And I think that concept of resiliency is really important in North America because it rejects this idea, this dual framework of either like the ecological Indian who's really good at managing the environment or the destructive native who doesn't know enough modern science to get it right. And so I think resiliency is an extension of that kind of theorizing that can be used in different contexts to think about land use over time.
Yeah, so I think let's just applaud our speakers one last time.